Okay, I think we're ready to start then. So welcome to everyone to this International Manifesto group discussion, which today is focusing on the recent economic deals in East Asia and with the EU and China. I'm Jenny Clegg and I'm standing in for Radhika today, who is a bit indisposed at the moment, nothing too serious, as she should be fine soon, so don't worry. In case you haven't seen me before, I've spent a lifetime trying to follow the developments in China. I've written on China and multipolarity, and I'm active in the peace and anti-war movements in Britain at the moment. Just a few words about the International Manifesto group, which was set up during the pandemic, holding fortnightly meetings to discuss the rapidly changing political and geopolitical economy of the world order. We have an ever-growing membership around the world, from both North and South America, Japan and India, Europe and Russia, as well as Africa. So without more ado, let's move on to our topic. At the end of last year, somewhat unexpectedly, Japan, South Korea, China and ASEAN signed up to the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, whilst China and the EU came to an agreement covering investment, the CAI, or the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. So these were initiatives entirely independent of the United States, and the shift towards multipolarity was palpable, coming as these agreements did so soon following the US launch of a new Cold War against China. To help us assess these developments, we have a really impressive panel of speakers today. In fact, we have 8 people in all. I'll introduce them one by one. Each will have 8 minutes, max 9 minutes, to present their views, and if we move on in a sprightly fashion, we should be able to get on to questions after a little over an hour. And perhaps I could ask everyone to just make sure that they're muted unless they're speaking. To start us off, our first speaker is John Ross. John is well known to this group, so I will just say that he is Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of Shanghai. And he's also a founding member of the international campaign, No to a New Cold War. Unfortunately, John is not able to be with us today, but we do have a recording of his contribution. So please, can we see John's speech?
That I can't be there in person.
You do it from mine.
I had a long-term engagement today, which I couldn't change. I think the question of China's economic trade deals at the present time, particularly Rcep, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is very important from several points of view. It's important from the point of view of the structure of the world economy. It's important from immediate political situations which exist in geopolitics, and it's very important from a strategic point of view. So I want to try to outline these in the way that I see them. The first relates to the question of what is the real structure of the world economy at the present time. There is a term which is used, which is called globalization. But I actually think this term is somewhat inaccurate. And I can put it in the following way. There's a sort of presentation which can sometimes take place, which is that previously we had the world divided up into nation states, particularly European-sized nation states. And then we've made a jump towards what is called a globalized economy, or in the name of a best-selling book, The World is Flat, which means basically geographical distance has been abolished. I don't actually think that this is correct. It is true, of course, that the interconnection between regions of the world economy has increased, particularly, say, compared to the 1930s, right? But rather than this view of globalization, the formula that I would use is what we are developing towards is continental scale economies. That is, distance has not been abolished. On the other hand, that it is true that the classical European scale nation state, let's say anywhere between 10 million people and 60 million people or something, has become too small as a productive unit. And I think that what is actually occurring is the development of what I would call continental scale economies. Really, there are three in the world. One is the continental scale economy, which is developing in the United States, in North America, of which don't forget that actually the foreign trade of the United States is really dominated only by three countries, which is China, which is the one which is outside of North America, Canada, and Mexico. It's not really a globalized economy. It's a continental scale economy with a addition, that is the Canada and Mexico, with the addition of China from outside. The second one is the European Union. Now that is generally regionally integrated. That's a regionally integrated continental economy. And the third one is China, central China. Now, there are some others who could have developed in the world. It's potential, because Asia is, you could have more than one continental scale economies within Asia. If the Indian government had a logical and sensible policy, which it doesn't, you could have a continental scale economy which was basically centered on South Asia. You have a development which is taking place, which is less developed, but for example, in Latin America, Chavez and people proposed for continental scale economy in Latin America. And I think that this would be very good. And you have developments to integration within Africa. Now, the peculiarity is, of course, these continental scale economies, in some cases, individual countries are so large that they either constitute the whole of this continental scale economy or clearly dominate it. So, for example, in North America, obviously the United States dominates the North American continental scale economy. China obviously dominates the East Asian continental scale economy. In Europe, no single country has that scale of dominance. In that framework, Rcep is an expression of this development of a continental scale economy. Secondly, if you look at this from the point of the development of countries, there is a formula which is used in Asia, which is called the flying geese phenomenon, which means that there are countries which are the most technologically advanced, but which go forward, and other countries have a catch up with them technologically. Historically, Japan was the technological leader within Asia. And I think that this is a very logical pattern of development. This is not oppressive imperialism, etc., in itself. Provided that the other countries in the region are going forward, it is not possible for a country to go from underdevelopment to being the most highly technologically developed economy in the world in a single step. It's just impossible. If you take what is happening in Asia, what is happening is the other countries which flew behind Japan are catching up. And now within Rcep, obviously the leaders are, the most important single economy is the question of China, but you have some technological leaders in the area as well, Japan and South Korea. And then you have the other countries which are developing up. I see nothing wrong in this, provided that all the countries are going forward. This is an advantageous model of political development, economic development. If we turn to the immediate situation, I think that the Rcep was a very serious setback for the United States. The first is some of its closest allies, Australia and Japan, ignored the positions of the United States and wanted to participate in this. The reason is because of this continental scale economy. They don't want to cut themselves off economically from China. But I also think very crucial was the role played by Vietnam. By chance, Vietnam was the chair of the ASEAN during the final negotiations of Rcep, therefore placing it in a very advantageous tactical position to help to sabotage the negotiations if it had wanted to. On the contrary, China has made very clear that it greatly praises Vietnam's role in helping bring about Rcep. This is obviously a failure of US foreign policy towards Vietnam, because one of the main goals of the United States has been to attempt to set Vietnam against China. And this was shown in Rcep to be a complete failure. It's also the second geopolitical failure is the situation in the South China Sea, because obviously the United States has been attempting to create trouble within the South China Sea and provoke a crisis. But actually, most of these, I think probably all, but all the major countries in the South China Sea are signatories to Rcep. This means what they are prioritizing is economic development within the framework of the South China Sea, and they don't want to go along with the attempt of the US to artificially create a political crisis in the South China Sea. So I think both the bilateral relations with Vietnam and the cutting off of the attempt to create a crisis in the South China Sea are big geopolitical step forwards for China. Okay, right. I think there's also lessons from this about regionalization. The US has a model where it wants to obstruct, for example, Latin American unity, or it wants to obstruct African unity. One of the things of Chavez, which was very good, was he attempted to strengthen links between the Latin American countries. The US doesn't like this. It's well known that the transcontinental communications systems and transport systems in Latin America are much less developed than their communications with the United States. And the United States very much favors this situation. Therefore, the attempt which was made by Chavez and other left-wing governments in Latin America to build up a regional economic bloc was very important. And China has a different economic policy because China supported the construction of such a regional bloc. Developments of the same type are being attempted. They're a bit weaker, but nevertheless also being attempted by Africa. And I think that this is a model which should be created. We should be favoring the construction of continental economic blocks, and this is an important counterweight to the United States. Right, okay. Finally, this comes to the question of economic development. If we reject the idea that the world is flat and that globalization has abolished distance and nationality and other things, nevertheless, it is the case that what we might call European scale economies, by which I mean, as I say, 10 million to 50 million people, are too small for the present development of the productive forces. You need regional scale development, development towards what I would call a continental scale economy. And I think that Rcep is an expression of that. So therefore, my summary of this would be that Rcep is a very important step forward from the point of view of the structure of the world economy, and also from the point of view of the immediate geopolitical concerns of China, and also from the point of view of strategic questions which are posed, for example, in Latin America and Africa. That would be my observations. Thank you very much for listening. And again, I apologize I couldn't actually be there in person because I would very, very much like to have participated in the discussion. Thank you.
Jenny, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Moving on swiftly then. We're very privileged to have with us Horace Campbell, who's Professor of African American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University. His recent book is Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya. and he's written extensively on Pan-Africanism and on development issues. And I'm particularly grateful for his work on China-Africa. So Horace, if you're ready.
Thank you very much.
On this one.
Thank you very much. I thank you for the invitation, Radical. And I am now becoming familiar with the International Manifesto group. And from the outset, I must say that the framing of the question for today is not what I'd signed up to. When Radical invited me, she invited me to speak on my most recent article on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the future of the dollar. And I wanted to frame my statements in the context of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because the Regional Comprehensive Partnership was not initiated by China, as the media has been presenting. This inclusive starting point led by the ASEAN 10 was to bring the 5 existing free trade agreements into a single regional framework, enabled others to jump on board. Others like China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. India was to be part of this agreement, but it opted out. I've been following the initiatives of the ASEAN countries since 1997, the financial crisis. And I've been calling on the peoples of global Africa to study and learn the positive lessons of how the RCEP agreement represents one more step towards an ongoing evolution of Asia's trade and financial architecture. It will serve as another action-forcing catalyst shaping the agenda for a post-dollar world. And in the conclusion, I want to say how this post-dollar world is calling for the decommissioning of the IMF and the World Bank and the establishment of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Reparations, because reparative justice in terms of how we reorganize the world to deal with questions of health, global warming, exploitation and imperialism, these are the questions that are before the international society. So RCEP, in my view, is a catalyst towards a break from the imperial forms of trade and currency agreements. The most basic thing RCEP will do when it once goes into force, by now what looks like it will happen in 2021, is to increase certainty and predictability in international trade between participating nations in Asia. There's 3 legs to this tool of the continued evolution of the alternatives to the US dollar and to the so-called Chinese leadership. The first leg has been the CPP-TPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The second is the Digital Economic Partnership Agreements initiated by Singapore with Japan. And now we're going to see that with Singapore and Australia. And the third is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. I want to focus on the third, because when the RCEP was first mooted at the tail end of the financial crisis, the Chinese poo-pooed the ideas, because at that time, the Chinese believed that their economic dominance could be assured via bilateral economic relations with individual ASEAN countries. In the period of the weaponization of everything, that is the weaponization of finance, the weaponization of trade, weaponization of currency, weaponization of information, the Chinese political and business leadership sought to come under the ASEAN political and intellectual leadership. So the point is that the political and intellectual leadership for ASEAN came from countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia, where in Indonesia there are elements in the society that continues to speak of the spirit of Bandung guiding the ASEAN project that is a spirit of bread, peace, and justice. Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand are all agreed that they need to come under the umbrella of the ASEAN societies, who via RCEP has created a community that is the leading economic community in the world today. Now, this new trade situation brings us back to the fragility of the international situation in the period 1913 to 1945, and the period in the up to 1956 and the collapse of the pound sterling. One of the most important things for us to look at is how to look at alternatives to the US dollar in terms of how they respond to the new architecture of ASEAN. That is, RCEP architecture has done the most fundamental thing, that is to create alternatives to the US dollar and the US dollar-led economy. Famously, there was a white lady who 30 years ago said there is no alternative. Now, Rcep has said that there is an alternative to the dollar. So I want to end by saying there are a number of implications. The first is that ASEAN is a negotiating platform that is not led by the US or China. Rcep is ASEAN-led for the peoples of Asia, and China has joined, and China does not have the intellectual and political leadership to be able to lead that process. The second is that the ASEAN countries are not dependent on the dollar as a vehicle currency. While they use the dollar, there are effective mechanisms of digital trade and barter deals to bypass the dollar. Thirdly, these ASEAN countries have been outside of the direct firing line of the weaponization of finance. So those in the direct firing line of the weaponization of finance are Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and that means that the ASEAN countries have room for maneuver in the development of alternative currency platforms. Fourthly, the establishment of the platforms for new rules led by ASEAN countries, such as the Chiang Mai Initiative or the ASEAN Development Bank, merges with the Chinese resources that comes from the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to create a platform for an alternative for an international currency regime. The cogent point about this is that it's an architecture for Asians, led by Asians. The last point I want to make is with the international situation. The United States has reached the end of its bullying, and white racism holds back the competitiveness of the United States of America. And racism ensures that it cannot unleash the creativity of the population inside of the United States of America. And so the challenge is how we in the international community create a world that is free from imperialism, racism, and the legacies of exploitation of the colonial type. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Horace, for your vision there. Next, we have Mick Dunford, who is a regular to this group. Mick is Emeritus Professor at the University of Sussex and a visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He's also managing editor of the journal Area Development and Policy. Over to you, Mick. And could I just make sure that everyone is muted, please, unless they're speaking. Mick.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to start by making a few remarks about the idea of free trade, because as was just pointed out, Rcep is a combination initially of 5 free trade areas. In a market economy, trade essentially depends on absolute advantage. So Adam Smith famously said, "Do not waste resources making at home what it will cost you more to make than buy. Now, of course, many people have followed that advice and then become unstuck when someone actually refuses to sell them something or provide them with something that they actually seriously need. But this idea of free trade, I mean, as Joan Robinson pointed out, it's associated with differences in competitive power, which can actually lead to a spiral of divergence between different parts of the world. And in some senses, one can say that it has often been used as an economic weapon by economically competitive countries to impose their will on other parts of the world. So Joan Robinson pointed out that the imposition of free trade on Portugal killed off a promising textile industry and left her with a slow-growing export market for wine. While for England, exports of cotton cloth led to accumulation, mechanization, and the whole spiraling growth of the Industrial Revolution, and indeed, what we call the Great Divergence. And she also pointed out that unequal exchange could hamper a country's development. So I think first we have to be very careful when we speak about ideas of free trade. At the same time, the second point is that managed, as opposed to liberal market, simple liberal market integration, can actually generate win-win outcomes, mutually beneficial outcomes. John Ross tried to speak about these in relation to Akamatsu's flying geese idea. But it's quite clear that creating larger market areas can actually generate greater productivity as a result of economies of scale. It can lead to a significant reduction in uncertainty. It can lead to increased bargaining power. It can lead to technological spillovers. It can reduce social overhead costs, and it can increase the efficiency of value chains. And indeed, if you look at the Rcep proposals, some of them are really concerned with accumulated content rules that are designed to improve the competitiveness of Asian supply chains. The third point I want to make is that, indeed, as Horace pointed out, I mean, China initially was not especially interested in Rcep, but it became interested in Rcep as a result of Obama's pivot to Asia and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, essentially, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was designed to contain China. It was designed to give the United States, multinational corporations, privileged access to markets in Pacific Asia and to impede China's development. It was also designed to actually set extremely strict rules that are very difficult to satisfy by many developing countries. And then it could subsequently, use these rules as a kind of bargaining counter, because the United States imagined that at some point China might want access to some of these markets, and it could use its desire to join in the same way in which it used China's desire to join the WTO. In other words, it can use those rules to force China to make changes in economic policy that it would not otherwise, as a sovereign state, want to make. Now, in the end, of course, we know that TPP fell apart. But it was in that context, really, that China actually started to become strongly interested in Rcep. Because for China, in a way, entering Rcep was a way of preventing the creation of a wedge separating China from Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is extremely important to China. In 2019, it accounted for 43% of Chinese imports. It accounted for 37% of Chinese exports. So China had a 91 billion trade deficit with the member countries of Rcep. The point I want to elaborate on a little is the importance of the rules that are established when one establishes these economic integration arrangements. And I want to do that by talking about, first of all, an issue that occurred recently. I mean, in 2020, the Better Cotton Initiative announced that it had suspended licenses in Xinjiang for the cotton grown in Xinjiang and processed in Xinjiang. It said that this suspension was due to, and I quote, current complicated international environment. and also to the updating of standards. When it was asked about the suspension, the Shanghai office of BCI said that it simply translated an instruction from its head office in Switzerland. That office said that in 8 years that included randomized inspections, it had not seen a single case of forced labor. So its own records, its own investigations demonstrated no case. And yet,
Mick, have you muted?
One second, it might be my mistake. I'm just going to unmute him. Mick, please unmute yourself and go back about a minute.
Go back a minute. I started to talk about the Better Cotton Initiative. In 2020, announced that it had suspended licenses in Xinjiang, explaining that it was due to the current complicated international environment and the need to update standards. I indicated that in, amongst other things, randomized inspections in Xinjiang, it had not discovered a single case of forced labor. Then, shortly afterwards, H&M, which I pointed out has 520 stores in China, 1.4 billion in sales in 2019, and I said has been found in China to sell from its stores fake and substandard products, made a statement referring to the use of forced labor and announcing that it would not be able to use Xinjiang cotton. And these global producers have to use fabrics that have been approved by standards organizations. So that meant that many international companies manufacturing cotton goods in China now have to import cotton rather than purchase cotton from Xinjiang. What is interesting is that BCI actually faces challenges from the United States, because in July 2020, the US Department of Agriculture set up the US Cotton Trust Protocol, as it itself wants to set the rules. So in a sense, one starts to wonder to what extent, this suspension of licenses was linked to the international context. In a sense, I'm merely speculating, but I'm trying to give an illustration of the extraordinary importance of the ways in which rules are set in shaping the gains and losses from trade, and how these rules are what in a sense determines whether what is put in place is genuinely win-win, which in a sense is what I think as Ian through Rcep is seeking to put in place. How much more time have I got?
Well, not very much.
I can finish
time.
If you want and say other things later. I mean, I was going to make another point about these rules, because in a sense, trade is also being used as a weapon to prevent China from moving up the value chain and playing a lead role in some of the industries that are going to lead the next industrial revolution. And I'm going to talk about that extremely important book by Frédéric Pierucci called Le Piège Américain, The American Trap, which is the case of a French company, Alstom, right, whose executives were arrested in the United States, and it was accused of using bribes to gain contracts in other parts of the world. In the end, it lost a case in the United States and had to pay $772 million US in fines that it was unable to sell. So in that situation, it had to sell its electrical energy assets to its principal US competitor, General Electric. Mitsubishi of Japan, Siemens of Germany were interested, but they were scared off by the fines. So in this case, you see the exercise, of rules, in a way which is designed in a sense to reinforce the advantage of economically advanced countries. So I was going to say, my final remark, okay? I'll just say that, I can say more later.
Very briefly.
It does seem to me, you know, that by joining Rcep and ASEAN initiative, China has actually outmaneuvered the United States. And I also think, you know, in the light of what Horace was saying earlier, I was thinking about a quotation from the Japanese Admiral, Isoroku Yamamoto, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when he said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." And in a sense, I hope, you know, that maybe this marks a point where, you know, coming back to what Horace said, that we see the emerging world start to establish the resolve to alter the rules of the international game such that they are more advantageous to the disadvantaged and less developed parts of the world.
Thanks very much then, Mick. I'll now call on Tomu Marukawa. He's a professor at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Tokyo, and his work focuses on the Chinese economy and industries, and he's also published work on East Asia with a particular knowledge of mobile phone and automobile industries. So Tomu, are you there?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful online conference. Well, I think Rcep will be a great initiative for the economic integration and advancement for Asia. And Rcep has a potential to give Japanese economy boost since it covers 46% of Japan's external trade. Rcep has broader coverage than the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The current TPP, which is the CPTPP, covers only 15% of Japan's trade. So even if the United States comes back to the TPP and joins it, TPP's coverage is still narrower than the Rcep. And Rcep is also important for Japan because it is the first free trade agreement between Japan and China, and also between Japan and South Korea. So that is the reason why it is so important for Japan. Recently, the Japanese government made an assessment before the Diet that joining Rcep will boost the Japanese economy by 2.7%, which is much larger than the impact of the TPP, which is only 1.5%. Even with its greater impact, media attention in Japan is more focused on the new Cold War between the United States and China. Japanese media seems to be more enthusiastic with the idea of with the US, Australia, India, and Japan, which is intended to contain China. It is almost forgotten that the Rcep was initially proposed by Japan. From China's perspective, Rcep is also an important step towards breaking through the isolation which the United States is trying to create around China. Rcep covers 32% of China's external trade, and therefore it will have a major impact on Chinese economy. What is equally important for China is that Rcep includes several countries with which China has been having some diplomatic disputes over the past few years, like South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and Australia. But it is also notable that China has officially expressed its intention to join the CPTPP. President Xi Jinping said last November that China will consider positively about joining the CPTPP. Japanese Prime Minister said in December that there remained many obstacles for China to join CPP, suggesting that China was not so welcome. However, even in the 14th five-year plan, which was resolved in the recent China's National People's Congress, it was stipulated that China will still consider seriously about joining the CPP, as well as pushing forward the China, Korea, Japan trilateral free trade agreement. By joining CPP, however, the coverage of free trade agreements for China will increase only by 4%, while for China to join CPP, China may have to accept its requirements on state-owned enterprises, which does not seem to be a so easy task for China. So I think the cost for joining CPTPP will be competitive greater than its economic benefits of joining it. A former vice minister of the Ministry of Commerce in China said recently that joining CPP may force some domestic industry to reform. I think China's proposal for entering CPTPP is motivated more by politics than by economics. I think China's intention is to show its willingness to join a pre-existing international system rather than to create its own system centered around China. So it is often talked in Japanese media that the Belt and Road Initiative is China's strategy to create a great international system. However, I think this is already not true, not correct. Belt and Road Initiative lost such meaning. So I think China is pretending, China's want to show itself that it is not going to create its own system, but want to join the system already existing there. So I think it is a good sign for Japan to consider seriously about letting China coming into CPP so that we can use that to urge China's liberalization and adjustment of its economic system, which has been leaning towards more state control. I think an isolated China is like to become more troublesome for neighbors. So I think it is good for us to let China come in to our group. Okay, that's all for my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those thoughts, Tomu. We're now halfway through. We're clearly going to be running quite well over the hour, but let's move on swiftly. Next, we have a voice actually from ASEAN, and that's Joseph Puruganan, who is head of the Philippine Office of Focus on the Global South and convener of Trade Justice Filipinas, regional coordination committee member of Rcep, campaign with extensive knowledge of ASEAN from a civil society perspective. So Joseph, if you're there, please.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Let me also begin by thanking Radhika and the International Manifesto Group for inviting me to be part of this panel to help unpack China's new trade deals. I'll be speaking about Rcep as well, but perhaps more from the perspective of a trade justice campaigner, questioning the rationale behind these ambitious economic agreements that have benefited a few and for most part work against the interests of the many. There's now a strong push from governments across the 15 Rcep countries to galvanize broad public support for this comprehensive agreement in a move to secure ratification and concurrence for it to come into effect. So far, the deal has secured ratification in China and Thailand, and the processes towards ratification have been initiated across all parties, with most countries eyeing 2021 completion of this process. But governments are leaving out crucial issues that must be considered, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to put in place more progressive economic policies that would support the needs of the poor and the marginalized. COVID-19, the contraction of the global economy, and growing calls from CSOs to stop FTA negotiations were clearly not enough to deter parties from the 15 countries to conclude the talks now considered the world's largest free trade agreement. We will recall that parties declared substantial conclusion of these talks as early as 2019, with only the trade in goods aspect being ironed out. And then the pandemic hit in early 2020, and like everything else, Rcep talks were likewise temporarily suspended. Virtual negotiations restarted, however, in April 2020, and monthly online discussions ensued, with 2 more negotiating rounds and 2 ministerial conferences before the talks were concluded in November 2020. Thailand's chief negotiator was quoted in the Bangkok Post as having said this about the negotiations proceeding despite the lockdowns. We, quote, "We trade negotiators have completed many negotiation issues during the past 2 months. It is faster and saves on time and cost. COVID-19 brings a new normal to trade negotiations." The shift to online communications, however, had at least one casualty: civil society participation. In the first place, Rcep talks, and most FTA talks for that matter, have not necessarily been a completely open, transparent, and participatory space for civil society engagement. In fact, in the case of Rcep, the only space for directly engaging the Trade Negotiating Committee, called the Stakeholder Engagement Process, was only organized in 2016, a full 3 years since the negotiations had begun. The Stakeholder Engagement Process, nevertheless, still provided a space, albeit limited, for CSOs and grassroots movement to raise concerns about the agreement directly to trade negotiators. So how is the agreement now being sold? No? An agreement that has been kept off limits to the public, with no access to the negotiating text and very limited engagements in the process, is now aggressively being sold as part of the efforts to secure parliamentary concurrence. The drive to sell Rcep to the broader public and galvanize support for the agreement is evident in the pronouncements from governments on the significance of the agreement. A foremost concern, of course, across the globe is the pandemic and the economic and social issues induced by the health crisis. It is not surprising, therefore, that Rcep is also being promoted as a key response to the crisis and a driver of recovery. The joint leader statement on Rcep, presented at the virtual signing ceremony in November, asserted, and I quote, "In light of the adverse impact of the pandemic on our economies and our people's livelihood and well-being, the signing of the Rcep demonstrates our strong commitment to supporting economic recovery, inclusive development, job creation, and strengthening regional value supply chains, as well as our support for an open, inclusive, rules-based trade and investment agreement." One question that has continuously hounded these talks is, what exactly is China's role in these negotiations? Many have described the Rcep talks as China-led. If you take a broader geopolitical view and look at the landscape of FTA negotiations across the globe, it's easy to see why one would think that way. Aside from the Rcep, the global landscape is dotted with key mega FTA negotiations. There was at one point the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or TPP, which many characterize as US-led trade negotiations. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, or TTIP, between the US and the European Union. And then the EU itself was quite actively engaged in FTA talks with Asia, launching its new partnerships with Asia in 2007, with simultaneous trade talks with India, Korea, and ASEAN. Asia has become an important hub for these new generation FTAs. We can point to 3 main reasons why this is so. Asia is a high growth region. Therefore, its growing market is a target for economic expansion. Second, it's also an important source of raw materials. Developed economies need to import these raw materials in order to export competitively. Securing access to these raw materials is therefore an important strategic consideration. And the third reason is China. The EU and the US, for instance, connect China's efforts to secure trade deals with the rest of Asia as an expansion of its not just economic but political influence in the region. On the other hand, if one looked at the agenda of more ambition, greater coverage of what true free trade believers call a high standard FTA that was pushed in the Rcep talks, and who were the players that were most aggressively pushing that agenda, one can say that in fact Japan, Korea, to some extent Australia, and lesser extent New Zealand countries outside ASEAN that were also engaged in the TPP negotiations were the ones driving negotiations. Then there was ASEAN and its projection of ASEAN centrality. The assertion that Rcep is in fact built on ASEAN's FTA with its development partners. ASEAN developed its own guidelines for Rcep negotiations where it emphasized the importance of recognizing the asymmetries that exist among Rcep parties and push for flexibilities for least developed countries. To what extent this flexibility is reflected in the final text is therefore a true test of ASEAN centrality. And as I'll point out later, while Rcep was not as ambitious as the developed countries had hoped for, and there were elements of the Rcep agenda that were left out for the time being, like the dreaded investor-state dispute settlement mechanism or the TRIPS Plus provisions, it looks like ASEAN will not benefit much from the deal, and in fact would see its balance of trade worsen. So how are governments selling this agreement? Many have touted the agreement as a big political win for China, highlighting how the agreement would sustain China's advantages in global supply chains. Other leaders have used Rcep as an opportunity to highlight Rcep in light of their own development needs. Sok Sipana, an advisor to the Cambodian government, referred to Rcep as a, quote, victory of multilateralism, and is a good pull for regional economic cooperation and integration. The Philippine government, on the other hand, chose to highlight the positive impact of the agreement on investments. Lost in the chorus of positive messages and effectively left out in the discourse, however, are key issues that have been consistently raised by CSOs and grassroots movements. Number one is the secrecy in the negotiations. The negotiations have clearly failed the transparency and public participation test. A CSO report on Rcep and transparency found that there was no or very little publicly available information on the state of the negotiations, draft texts, or key government positions throughout the negotiating process. There were very limited or token ad hoc stakeholder engagement forums, as mentioned earlier. Parliaments or other public institutions have very little opportunity to impact or influence this process. Second, the dangers of modern FTA. Governments are bragging that Rcep is a modern FTA, but give no further explanation of what that means or what the implications would be. A modern trade and investment agreement means that the scope and coverage of the agreement cover not just trade in goods, but also services, intellectual property rights, investments, and more recently includes a chapter as well on electronic commerce. A modern or new generation FTA would push further liberalization and deeper obligation to open the economy and harmonization of regulations in the name of policy coherence. Another impact is rising imports and declining exports. A new working paper from Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, focusing on Rcep's good market access implications for ASEAN, by Rashmi Banga, Kevin Gallagher, and Prerna Sharma, a detailed disaggregated product level impact analysis of tariff liberalization based on actual tariff schedules, found at least three, for me, are the main findings. Number one, the results of the simulation show that tariff liberalization under Rcep will deteriorate the existing balance of trade of ASEAN vis-a-vis Rcep countries by 6% per annum, while balance of trade will improve for some of the non-ASEAN countries in the Rcep. Second, the maximum gains in terms of improved balance of trade will go to Japan, followed by New Zealand and Australia. Post-Rcep balance of trade will worsen for Cambodia, Indonesia, Lao PDR, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And third, Rcep sensitive list analysis reveals that it is the developed countries, not the developing countries, which have been able to negotiate higher protection against imports as compared to ASEAN countries or even least developed countries within ASEAN. The balance of trade issue is also related.
Now. Sorry,
okay, just to conclude. Yes. So I think the main point is that on the question of who is driving Rcep, we can debate about whether it's China, whether it's Japan, or whether it's ASEAN. But it is clear, at least from campaigners' point of view, that it is really the corporate agenda that is driving that drove the negotiations. And as you can see from the latest studies, that even if the ASEAN is saying that this is central to the negotiating process, that the benefits really will not redound to ASEAN, but in fact, the balance of trade post-Rcep will be worse for ASEAN countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for that critical perspective. We now have C.P. Chandrasekhar, who's professor at the Center of Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's co-authored several books on the Indian economy. So let's hear the Indian perspective, please. Chandra,
okay.
if you're there.
Yeah. Yes, I am here. Thanks. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks to Radhika Desai and the others in the team for having me participate in this discussion. In the few minutes I have for this first statement, I think one should start by asking the question, what exactly is the principal play, not in terms of the negotiations which occurred, but in terms of the outcome which we have once our RCEP has been the agreement has been arrived at. Of course, it's large. It's close to one. If you look at it from one side, it's about a half of the world's population, about 40% of global production, maybe 30% of world trade. All of this get covered by the countries which participate in this negotiation. And but on the other hand, it's also true that since it has subordinated a whole host of agreements, pre-existing agreements, something like 80% of merchandise trade, which is covered by this, was actually covered by pre-existing arrangements. So there are some people who basically said, or say that, listen, it's not that we've really gone very far in terms of having something new. It's just that you put together a certain set of agreements which already existed. And principally, of course, that if you take areas which normally tend to be important components of free trade agreements, like investment rules, intellectual property rights, etc., there has been a certain degree of caution in going far on that. In fact, China wouldn't possibly have been part of it if these kinds of rules had been pressed. But what we definitely do have is a harmonization of tariffs at a relatively low level, and more importantly, relaxed rules of origin, which basically means that participants within this bloc have the ability to be able not merely to export from where they are at, but to relocate and export from wherever they want to go, because rules of origin are now a little more relaxed because of the fact that all of these countries are participants in a single agreement. Now, this obviously does mean, as people have mentioned, that, in some sense, given the countries which have come together here, the fact that India decided to withdraw, and the fact that the United States is not there, does definitely mean a certain degree of loss of influence in East Asia and possibly in East and South Asia put together of the United States. Because let us not forget that it was because of US and IMF objection that the Asian Monetary Fund was not established after the 1997 crisis. Let us not forget that in terms of the safety net, which was created as a part of a regional cooperation agreement, the Chiang Mai Initiative and the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization included an IMF-linked component, which essentially meant that to start with 10%, subsequently 20%, that moved to 30%. If you really borrow more than that of your quota as part of these arrangements, which were basically central bank swap arrangements, you ended up with a situation where you had to first go to the IMF, enter into an agreement, and present the fact that you had an IMF program online, and that IMF would be the agency which would be responsible for monitoring and enforcing conditionality. So we've actually had a long situation where even when the US was not part of an agreement, like the Chiang Mai Initiative, like the CMIM, etc., it still had an influence through the IMF, which was accepted by these countries, partly because of the geopolitical tensions which characterize each, wondering whether the situation is going to be that whether China is going to dominate, Japan is going to dominate, particularly Japan because it earlier dominated, or whether South Korea is going to lose out as a result of these kinds of arrangements. So the best is to move control out of the region and have surveillance, monitoring, as well as enforcement in the hands of the IMF, even though now there is talk of establishing some kind of a regional monitoring and enforcement agency and agenda. Now, besides the loss of the US's position here directly, there is also a loss of US position because of the fact that the way in which sort of, regional strategy is panning out for the US, and is that India has become quite crucial as a player in the effort to whatever, contain China, whatever it may be, how you want to phrase it. But essentially in the standoff between the United States and China, which is really doesn't seem to be softening after the coming of the Biden administration, India has been quite crucial. I mean, India is part of the Quad, which is Japan, Australia, US and India. And India is being made the hub for the manufacture of vaccines on the basis of US technology to deliver all across the region. And of course, the whole idea was that India would stand up in regional arrangements and try and establish a presence which goes beyond South Asia through its so-called Look East policy. Now, why did India, in some sense, withdraw? There were many reasons why India had a problem. One, of course, is the absence of competitiveness. If you look at most of the free trade agreements which India has entered into with the ASEAN, with Japan, with Korea, it's built over a period of time significant and widening trade deficits. Of course, it has a trade deficit with China, but it doesn't have any agreement with China. And it now is trying to impose restrictions on imports from China, both through enforced compliance and through actual tariffs and quantitative restrictions, which are WTO compliant. But the basic point is, as far as the agreements it has entered into, you have had situations where trade deficits have risen from 5 billion to 22 billion in the case of ASEAN, from 3.5 to 8 billion in the case of Japan, etc., and 7 to 12 billion in the case of Korea. And therefore, the experience is that entering into these agreements, given the absence of competitiveness, the fact that it didn't make the manufacturing transition the way in which many other developing countries in the region did, is resulted in a situation of a certain degree of reticence. And this reticence has increased because of the fact that over a period of time, Chinese presence in the Indian market has grown hugely, of course, which is now being responded to, as I said. Now, the thing is, in particular, there were certain sectors, like the steel sector, like the dairy sector, etc., where it was perceived that India would lose out significantly. And there was obviously opposition because there might be corporate interest, as was mentioned just now. But as far as the peasants were concerned, the workers were concerned, etc., this was seen as something which would undermine. And since the negotiations were not occurring based on reporting and discussion in Parliament, obviously there was a lot of opposition. But at one point of time, the government itself, the current Modi government, which otherwise tries to present itself as being completely committed to a neoliberal agenda involving freer trade and a much more relaxed or open policy regime vis-a-vis foreign investors, both financial and foreign direct investors, that it decided that it needs to actually pull out. And it's interesting that the way in which this was phrased is that while this might actually involve some kind of a diplomatic strategy loss, it actually cannot go, because the foreign minister of this avowedly neoliberal government said, in the name of openness, we have allowed subsidized products and unfair production advantages from abroad to prevail. And all the while, this was justified by the mantra of an open, globalized economy. So here is a government which otherwise embraces neoliberalism and declares itself the most reformist which India has had ever since independence, is actually trying to say that listen, you can't have this kind of globalization. It's almost some kind of a Trumpian statement, okay? And privileging economics over diplomatic strategy, the foreign ministry said that Rcep at the end of the day is an economic negotiation. It has a strategic implication, but the merits have to be economic. So you, in some sense, we're privileging sort of economic issue, I mean, economic concerns over strategic concerns or political strategic concerns. Now, one reasoning could be that India decided to do this because it was betting on its relationship with the US and the Quad for strategic heft as well as economic benefits. Okay, so the idea is we get our economic benefits anyway. Why should we go and make this sacrifice? But the net result is obviously that actually China has managed to benefit hugely by the absence of Indian presence, and not because India per se is a competitive threat, but because of the fact that India can, in some sense, serve as a front for the United States, particularly being a member of the Quad, and given its close relationship now with the United States of America. Now, China's entry, of course, is surprising, as many people pointed out. It's because it's sitting at the table now, along with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, with whom it has had really fraught relations, not merely recently, but for quite a long period of time in the case, in particular, of Japan and South Korea. But it's definitely going to benefit from the one aspect of Rcep which is going through, which is harmonized tariffs and relaxed rules of origin. Because in one sense, if we look at Asian trajectories, at some point of time, export success economies run out of steam. They run out of steam because of the fact, not merely because domestic costs rise, which China can control more, but because of the fact that there is a tendency to approach the Lewis turning point, that you actually are going to be in a situation where you run out of that large, in what appeared to be inexhaustible reserve of cheap labor. And that would actually undermine your competitiveness. And the second, of course, is that there would be a lot of pressure to strengthen your currency because of the fact that you've not only had these current account surpluses, but you're also been the target of large foreign capital inflows. So therefore, you would have to allow for your currency to strengthen over a period of time, or at least that would be a quid pro quo which is demanded by countries which serve as the markets for China. Now, therefore,
can you draw to a close now, briefly?
Yeah, I would. So what do countries, what would China would like to do? It would like, as happened in the case of Japan, as happened in the case of South Korea, etc., to relocate production capacities to the rest of the Asian region, still be in control of the Asian export platform, but through its firms, which of course are public firms and not private corporates, and do it in a way in which it can actually maintain this control. So basically, I think that if you put this as part of its multi-pronged strategy, the financing of investment, the Belt and Road Initiative, the network of bilateral swap agreements it is built in the Asian region, this does give China considerable leverage. To conclude, China, given the aggressive posture it has been taking politically and militarily in recent times, seems to say that if it's necessary, we'll go alone politically, but we want to cooperate economically. That seems to be the nature of its strategy. And unfortunately, India, by choosing exactly the opposite, by saying that, listen, we are going to privilege economics over political strategy, has created a situation where that the counter to this doesn't really exist, which positive for China. What it is for the world, we'll have to wait and see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, putting India into the picture there. So our penultimate speaker is Reina Rupp, who's an economist with a fascinating background as a former intelligence agent with the Foreign Intelligence Services of East Germany. He succeeded in penetrating NATO headquarters in Brussels in 1977. He's been in prison for several years, and he's been writing commentaries for socialist newspapers on political, military, and geo-economic developments. So please, Reina, if you're there. Is Reina actually there?
Right. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, fine.
Okay. Right. During my time at NATO Political Affairs Division, I also used to be, for quite a few years, the secretary of the biannual China meeting, where the so-called experts, that means the intelligence experts of the NATO member countries on China and the surrounding nations came together. So I have a certain background on China, and which I had before and have kept ever since, and following the situation developments there. That's why I think a realistic analysis of the future trade of China, or with China, has to take place against the backdrop of Washington's Cold War policy against Beijing. The US foreign policy establishment had already started this policy of deliberate confrontation under President Obama, with, as we know, the Pivot to Asia initiative requiring reorientation and restructuring of US political and military warfare resources against Beijing. But Washington has already lost, in my view, this Cold War before it has started in earnest. Unfortunately, this reality has not yet sunk in with the key political actors in Washington. And and their helpers in NATO EU countries, as they are blinded more than ever by the hegemonic hubris and delusion that was only too evident at the recent high-level US-China meeting in Anchorage in Alaska, as we all remember very well who followed this meeting. We have yet to see how long it will take before the Biden administration and the increasingly reluctant NATO vassals realize that the few victories Washington may be able to score in this, what they call competition with China and Russia, I think we have to include this also as a Pacific nation, which needs to be counted into this equation. And this struggle will, or even these Washington's victories in this struggle will be costly and highly unaffordable Pyrrhic victories. As long as the Chinese and Russians don't let themselves be goaded to respond militarily to American provocations, their increasingly close strategic partnership will lead them to victory, not on military, but on economic grounds. Namely, on the grounds of their growing technological prowess. Just a few examples, the world's fastest computers stand now in China. China produces more PhD equivalent academics in math and natural science than the EU and US together. Moreover, China, in tandem with Russia, will ride to victory on their growing financial independence from US Western payments, banking, and financial services systems, on which they have made a great advantage over the last month again, and it's basically almost ready to start. And last but not least, their victory will be secured by their advanced commercial interdependence with their neighbors in the near and far abroad, by which the new initiatives, including the Belt and Road Initiative, is a major pillar. Already now, many nations that used to be under the tutelage of Washington have tilted towards China. The attraction of China's giant markets, 1.4 billion consumers with a steadily increasing purchasing power, is difficult to withstand, especially if compared with the dying and increasingly decadent US and European disintegrating US EU vassals. Indeed, the US economic outlook is dismal, with poverty growing fast and spreading increasingly into the over-indebted middle class. This image of the failing hegemon is augmented by the spreading internal instability, social decay, and by I would call it criminally incompetent and corrupt political leadership, which is irreparably polarized. The United States do not lead the world anymore by example of a blooming economy and the promises of equality and economic prosperity, but they try to maintain the hegemonic position by bullying with sanctions, threats of war, and actually real wars. Against this backdrop, Washington's would-be masters of the universe can only hope that their Five Eyes alliance, consisting of, as we know, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, and the US itself, remains intact. Washington can be happy if none of them will also tilt towards the great promises of the Chinese economic powerhouse, fueled by Russian energy and protected by a close Sino-Soviet Soviet-Russian integration, military integration. Many Asian, African, and even some Latin American nations have already made their decision in favor of China and the BRI initiative, undisturbed by US huffing and puffing. Other nations, which used to be firmer under US tutelage and where US vassals still make up most of the ruling elite, as is the case in most NATO EU countries, will prefer to sit on the fence. In other words, they will not openly break with Washington, while at the same time, they will seek to distance themselves from the excesses of US's aggressiveness against China, and thus hoping to keep access to the world's biggest and growing goods market and the largest and expanding, not the largest, but the large and expanding financial market. China's attraction for the rest of the world does not lie only in its immense role as a leading importer for raw materials to fashion goods, but China has also become a key link in the worldwide supply chain of crucial components for industrial production, from rare earth via processed materials for pharmaceuticals, used to high-tech components, for example, in telecom and AI systems. Currently, Australia is learning a bitter economic and trade lesson for having too eagerly become Washington's mouthpiece for the aggressive US policy and rhetoric against China. Economic tensions between China and Australia escalated after Canberra began cracking down on Chinese investment in the country. Relations deteriorated further after Australia cancelled contracts with Chinese telecom, Huawei and CTE due to US opposition to Chinese 5G technology. Tensions were further raised last year when Australia picked up on President Trump's obsession with the China virus, accusing Beijing and the Wuhan research laboratory of deliberately releasing the malicious coronavirus to destroy the West. In line with the Trump administration, the government in Canberra called for an international inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus outbreak, prompting accusations from Beijing that the Australian government was acting on orders from Washington. In response, China has imposed forbidding trade tariffs on a variety of Australia's main exports, namely raw materials, including coal and agricultural goods such as barley, wine, beef, lobster, etc., for which they have found eager suppliers in other regions. For Australia, China was by far the biggest export market, but not anymore. China is now buying elsewhere. Currently, a number of big EU and US corporations, such as, it has been mentioned earlier on, the international Swedish fashion retailer H&M, are making the same experience as Australia. They are big corporations which are firmly established in the Chinese market, where they earn a large share of their global profits. Recently, these firms felt compelled by domestic media pressure and their woke audiences at home to join in with the US-NATO psychological warfare campaign against Beijing over the latter's alleged treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang. But they paid dearly for their hypocritical virtue signaling, because this was followed by a fierce shitstorm from their clients in Chinese social media.
Reina, could you just make your final...
I'm almost there. Chinese platforms stopped H&M products. Chinese celebrities stopped endorsing foreign labels. Chinese internet companies distanced themselves from the Swedish retailer. Everything dropped, everything out. And in fact, China learned very well, or the Chinese internet learned very well from Twitter and YouTube, how to cancel things. And of course, it will only be a question of time before the accusation against China or the Uyghurs will disappear again from the homepages of these Western corporations. Apologies will follow, as it happened before in a similar development in 2018. And now my last sentence. And as to the futures, the dogs in Washington will continue to bark, but the world caravan along the new Silk Road will move on. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Reina, and thanks for bringing in Russia as well to the picture. Now we've got one more speaker, and I'd like after that speaker to move quickly on to questions. I'll try and take 3 at a time. So would you please be prepared with your questions, brief questions, by indicating on the hand function. So let's finish now with hearing from Bruno Drweski, who's a historian, political scientist from Belarus and Poland, and co-director of the Polish section of the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations at Sorbonne University. And I see is also an anti-war activist. Okay, over to you, Bruno.
Thank you very much. And yes, as I told you last time when we were talking about EU-Russia relations, I am in the short-term perspective rather pessimistic about the possibility for European countries to develop a realistic and sovereign policy competing with USA. We observe that concerning Russia, concerning Iran, concerning Palestine, and consequently concerning China, US pressures are always efficient. As long as the dollar will be dominant, USA will be able to use it against European interests in international trade, not only in US-European trade relation, and they will also be able to finance their networks of influence within political and media establishment in Europe to block any relation tending to develop Eurasian integration process. Recent developments between USA and EU have shown that German bourgeoisie is the only one in Europe able to carry on a policy defending more or less its own interests, what is not really the case of France or other Southern or Eastern European countries. In the same time, this shows that in spite of the neoliberal ideology, USA are more and more forced to use only political and ideological pressures so to impose their leadership in Europe. Such things like human rights, labor rights, environment issues, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet are recurring only pretexts they can use to cut or at least limit ties between EU countries and China, as soon as the cooperation goes too far from the point of view of Washington. It means US interference is mostly using political tools since USA have no more sufficient economical power to compete with China in Europe or elsewhere. If we look now in different European countries, beginning with Eastern EU countries, we can observe, of course, that they are most often skeptical or strongly opposed to Russia for political and mostly historical reasons artificially maintained after 1989. But most naturally, there exists no subjective reason why there should be no strong cooperation of these countries with China, since the geostrategical and geo-economical rationality for them of the One Belt, One Road initiative, putting them in the center of a new Eurasian hub is obvious. In the same time, these countries are under strong US pressures, tending to use Russophobic attitudes to cut all possible ties between Germany and Russia, as we could observe in the case of the Nord Stream project. And this pressure can also be considered as an indicator of the balance of forces between US political pressures and local economic interests, which are common, in fact, for Central Eastern Europe, Germany, and the rest of Europe to cooperate with China, the whole Eastern Asia, and the whole Eurasian mainland. Germany has, for commercial reasons, strong interest to cooperate with China and Russia, and Angela Merkel did play a strong role to finalize, after 7 years of negotiation in December of 2020, the EU-China Treaty on Investment, especially in a situation when China became, last year, the first EU commercial partner. But we can observe that this time again, since economical relations are progressing between EU and China, new political tensions arose, this time under the pretext of human and labor rights in Xinjiang. France, in the same time, is very dependent on Chinese imports, what the COVID crisis showed, since France is now dependent on Chinese and Indian pharmaceutical products and healthcare products. But new issues made the relation between France and China difficult. The CGTN TV was to be hosted in France after UK refused, and already a media campaign denouncing China so-called propaganda began now to force France not to allow this Chinese media on its soil. In the same time, in the late weeks, according to a French researcher in strategy, Antoine Bondaz, France has, quote, a still cutting-edge technology ahead of China, and it must know how to conduct its cooperation with China without jeopardizing national security and the competitiveness of French companies. This very extreme statement made Chinese embassy in Paris react in a very nervous way, and the strong demonstration it made against Bondaz provoked a tough reaction from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs against the Chinese ambassador. But if we observe that this researcher in strategy is most openly linked with Taiwan, we can assume that this tension could have been prepared in connection with US interests, especially since we observe in the same time, it means now, that a group of French senators suddenly planned to visit Taiwan, what was most obviously aimed at provoking a strong reaction from the Chinese embassy. All these events are showing there are in France, like elsewhere in the EU, strong forces pushing against French-Chinese or European-Chinese relations, always under non-economical pretext. Every observer understands that good and strong deals between EU countries and China would mean earlier or later a strategical autonomy for European countries toward USA and their integration within a vast Eurasian and Mediterranean zone of economical and strategical cooperation, what would mean quite automatically the end of the US leadership over the world. Officially, the visit of Blinken in the EU looked like if the new US Lord came to visit his European vassals. Finally, EU and USA did agree that between Western powers and China, there are, quote, elements of cooperation, competition, and systemic rivalry. Joe Biden was the guest of honor at the EU-USA summit. The US president affirmed the need of continued engagement between United States and EU on different issues. But the US president ended his speech with the issue concerning competition with China and the challenge it poses in the long term. In his eyes, there is a confrontation between democracies and autocracies, and the first one, of course, must win the battle. The EU and the US are liberal, so-called liberal democracies concerned with human dignity and freedom of expression. This principle do not mean, however, that CGTN TV, for example, can be considered in France as a normal expression of political pluralism. Of course, the main issue here is the economical question, economical issues United States cannot cope with anymore. And that's why they use political tools. Anyway, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, whose country trades heavily with China, was much more circumspect to the US demand. She recalled that the EU has already made the choice of strategical sovereignty, including this vis-a-vis China. We have, as she told, we have a common set of value with the United States of America, of course, which is quite unquestionable and clear, but we also have our own interests. There will be a lot of common ground with the US, but no identity. That is perfectly clear, she added. And then, as I would say, arrived tensions about Xinjiang. And this made that the Euro Parliament was able this week to postpone debates concerning the treaty signed after 7 years of negotiation. So now we are in this situation where the treaty is postponed by the European Parliament. Anyway, we can observe Berlin, contrary to Paris, has taken a more nuanced position than Washington toward China. The interest of German and US capital can obviously diverge, and German hegemony over the EU allows to assert Berlin's interest more strongly. Germany does not want to have to choose between Washington and Beijing. And in this context, Antony Blinken, the chief diplomat of the new democratic administration, tried to reassure the Germans, and Blinken even said that USA will not force Europe to choose between them and China. Countries, as he told, countries can work with China when possible. It is just not clear if this when possible is very reassuring for European-China cooperation, especially since the extraterritoriality of US law is an ever-present threat for European companies. And the case of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline between Russia and Germany is a good example of this. So we will observe if the same situation will finally happen with China. Finally, it should be noted that once again, it is Germany that is setting the tone in Europe, including on the geostrategic level. But until European peoples and nations do not openly stand up, and until the dollar corrupting world elites, and especially European elites, will not be replaced, European states and EU as a whole will not be able to carry on a real non-aligned policy concerning Washington and United States. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've now reached the end of the introductory talks. We've had a great range of perspectives on these developments from different parts of the world. We've also been given a huge amount of information, useful information to process. So we can now move on and hopefully have a good hour of questions and discussion. I'd like to take questions, three at a time, to put to speakers. So if you have a question directed at a particular speaker, please say who you're directing your question to, or if it's a general question, and then the speakers can respond as they wish. So if the speakers would also put up their hands on the hand function in that case as well. So please don't hesitate. I see Radhika has her hand up already. So let's go with Radhika.
Okay, thanks, Jenny, and thanks to all the speakers for absolutely fascinating discussion. And yeah, I'm sorry we designed it to have such a large number of speakers, but it was worth it to hear all the speakers, both on the Asian part and the European part. Quickly, then I have three questions. First, emerging directly from Bruno's concluding remarks, I just want to ask, especially given that, as both you and Reina emphasized, Germany is the one country that is most capable of sort of, pursuing its economic interests, which now lie increasingly eastward. But also taking into account the fact that some Eastern European countries and Italy have also been leaning towards China a bit. How do you expect the most immediate, in the sort of short and medium term, things to unfold, given that Europe's rather mild rebuke to China has reacted quite forcefully to it? So how, because in a certain sense, China is saying you can no longer sort of, have your economic cake and eat your sort of, a political moral high horse cake as well. So how do you think things will unfold? What will give? etc. Secondly, my question is specifically for Chandru. Again, thanks for a very insightful set of remarks, Chandru. I just wanted to know how you feel the capitalists of India, the different kinds, the very big ones, the medium ones, the small ones, and also across sectors. How do they range? How did they sort of, divide up between on the matter of Rcep? Who wants closer relations with China? Who doesn't? Etc. And then finally, a general question both for Chandru and basically everybody who spoke, particularly on the Rcep part of the thing. I mean, it seems to me that one of the main questions I have in my mind about Rcep is how does China, the non-capitalist character of the Chinese economy, how has that impacted the structure of Rcep, and how will that be taken, particularly by the other capitalist countries, not only Japan and South Korea, but others as well? And how will it impact? Is it possible, for instance, John Ross portrayed a very benign image of a flying geese model and how everybody can benefit, but the flying geese model does not work unless the countries concerned, the non-Chinese countries, actually have something like an industrial policy. So if you can please comment on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so 3 questions from Radhika. So let's go with that. So first of all, Bruno, Reina, have you got a response for the first question? Reina, briefly, yeah?
Yes, just to give you an example, VW is almost an institution in Germany. Now, VW has its main profit center now is in China. So many more major and large corporations in Germany, such as Siemens, etc. China is a great hope as a growing market, and from China into the rest of Asia. Now, at the same time, we have so from the economic point of view, there will be strong pressure against the political anti-Chinese ideology that is expressed mainly by the Greens. And the Greens are very, very active in combination with the Americans, also in the European Parliament. And therefore, they are likely to add considerable amount of votes in the next elections as the Christian Democrats and all other parties, because of the horrible Corona crisis management, are losing already in regional elections. The Christian Democrats, the leading Merkel's party, has lost about, in 2 regional elections, 15% each of the vote. So we can see that the ideology, anti-Chinese ideology, and those elites that are still firmly transatlantic and anchored in Washington may hold the fortress, the anti-Chinese fortress, for a little bit longer. But finally, economic reality, I think, like always in history, will determine the direction of politics. So it won't happen tomorrow, but I think it's inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Bruno.
Yes, so I agree with what Rupp just said, and I would add something. It's obvious that Europe and European countries have interest to cooperate with China. That's more obvious, and there's no point in that. And for the long term, I believe that, of course, economy will prevail. But in the meantime, we have strong ideological and political pressures from the United States, which are very efficient and which are not only based on politics and ideology, but which are also based on the dollar, and the dollar as a corrupting mean of European elite, because dollar you have to just to print them and to distribute them, and you corrupt people in a formal or rather most often informal way. But anyway, it works, and this is what I observe, and especially in the countries I'm looking at very strongly. It means Poland and France. I always notice that every time there is something going in the good direction for cooperation with China, there is always a political campaign on Xinjiang, on Tibet, on Hong Kong or Taiwan or whatever you want, but there is always something, and it breaks the dynamics. And as I told you in what I told you this week in France with the Taiwan issue after the Xinjiang issue, it works. Of course, for example, Radhika told about Italy, and Italy is a very interesting example because Italy showed at the beginning of the COVID crisis, I would say, a rather independent policy. And the cooperation policy on health issues with China and Russia and even Cuba. But as you saw, the government of Italy changed, and now we have Draghi at the top of Italy. And Draghi is the man of the European Bank and the World Banking System, and it looks he was sent to Italy to normalize that country. I would say normalize, of course, quote. And it works in the sense that he managed to create a national unity government going from the extreme right up to the so-called alternative parties. And it looks senseless, politically speaking, ideologically speaking, but it works. And if it works, we have to ask how those people were taken by the establishment, so to agree for the Draghi government, for example. And it's the same thing I remarked, for example, in Poland. There is a strong trend within elite to cooperate with China, which is obvious if you look at the map from Poland. It's obvious that Poland is interested in cooperation with China, because Poland is the gate to Western Europe of Chinese commerce. But every time there is, and it's even very, very interesting, because as you know, the Polish government is strongly anti-communist. They are criticizing communism all the time, except when Polish leaders go to China, they always forget to look that there are red flags there. But as soon as they come back to Poland, there is a campaign against China, and what was signed is stop. And I don't think it's it's by chance. I think that the American embassy is working well, and they have all these networks they have in every country, which are media networks and political networks, and it works. And that's my answer.
Right, thank you very much. And the question to Chandru now, Radhika's question about the different sectors of the economy, how are they reacting in India?
So if I got that, the idea is different sections of capital. I mean, what is there? There are two issues when we look at Indian capital that I think are important. First, of course, is despite now more than 3 decades of an effort to try and open up the economy and become an export-driven industrial sector, it hasn't happened. That we still have a situation where both foreign investors as well as domestic capitalists, operate for the Indian market and are doing pretty well operating for the Indian market. And even when we have special schemes like the production linked incentive scheme, etc., which is actually giving you know, as a subsidy for incremental production and investment in certain areas like telecom, electronic parts, and so on. Basically, the idea is that they're going to produce for the Indian market. The second, of course, is that, I mean, India, you know, it's so strange. At independence, India was considered to be among the countries in the ex-colonial world which had the greatest potential for industrialization, because, you know, Indian capitalists had been there since 1854 or so. There was the Bombay Plan. They were assertive. They knew what they wanted. The government wanted to drive this, and India had a pretty large domestic market. You know, it wasn't some kind of a coral atoll in the South Pacific. You know, it actually had a significant market. So it was expected that it would be the country which would see the most rapid industrialization among the underdeveloped countries at that point of time, which never happened. India's manufacturing never went beyond about 16, 17% of GDP. So there is a thought that there is an opportunity to get the government to push for industrialization, but they are interested in that industrialization based on the domestic market. So I think they would like to be protectionist. They would, in fact, like to keep this market for themselves rather than try and go and compete with whatever, China or Japan or, you know, who it may be in international markets. And it's partly the fear. So while Joseph is right that these kinds of FTAs are all, you know, corporate driven, they're driven by corporate interests, but also sometimes keeping away from them are also driven by corporate interests. And very briefly about the structure of Rcep, you know, I think finally the question is, can we identify a rising economic power in Asia? Because ever since, you know, the financial crisis in Japan in 1990, it's yet to recover really. It's been many decades, many lost decades it's faced. So if there is a rising power, it would be China. And if so, when you enter into agreements of this kind, the beneficiary, both in terms of the investment rules it would like to impose later, not today, and the trade rules which is going to benefit from today, would go to China. So I think the structure willy-nilly is biased in that direction.
Thank you, Chandru. I understand that you have to go in about 10, 15 minutes. Is that right?
Yes, please.
Can I just have one follow-up with Chandru since he has to go?
Yes, I was going to say that if anyone else has got a question for Chandru before he goes, then please do put your hands up.
So I'll just very briefly, yeah. Chandru, that's very interesting. But then if that's the case, if they want to protect their market, how do you explain the very high degree of import penetration of China into the Indian market for industrial goods?
Because at the point of time when liberalization began, the idea was that these capitalists would actually retool, re-engineer, and make themselves internationally competitive. And you know, because of the slack in manufacturing, they lost the battle at that point of time. But now, in fact, particularly with the coming of an extremely business-friendly or top business-friendly government, they see it as an opportunity. So all this, you know, in Atmanirbhar, self-reliant India, that's the new slogan, is of a neoliberal state, you know. So it's obviously this kind of an idea.
So does anyone else have a question for Chandru, and then we'll give him a chance to answer anything, and then he'll feel free to go. Mick, did you have your hand up there?
I was going to make a comment, but I can write to him since it's not about India. No, I mean, I think he made a comment about China and the Lewis turning point. I mean, if there was a Lewis turning point, it arrived 20 years ago when China started to move offshore and also move inland. But, you know, I do think it's quite important that you look at the kind of multiple fronts, you know, on which China is operating. Because basically, its whole development path is changing, you know, with this kind of dual circulation strategy to start with, which primarily focuses on consumption and investment in the domestic market. But then, you know, there's a considerable strengthening of industrial policies, you know, with Made in China 2025, with China Standards 2035. I mean, there's clearly this view that they want to move into the top end, you know, of some of these new technologies that, as I mentioned earlier, are going to drive the next industrial revolution, and that probably involve a very significant replacement of human labor. And then there are these programs for the development of these gigantic sort of connected cities, you know, around the Bay Area, around the lower Yangtze Delta, Beijing, Tianjin. And the whole idea that they're involved in constructing new, smart, green cities. And then you've got the view that far more people are going to live in the countryside. They're not going to follow this kind of Western path of industrialization, urbanization. So, you know, after an extraordinary program designed to lift everyone above the extreme poverty line, 10 years ahead of the United Nations target, there is now programs, you know, for rural vitalization, for the construction of an ecological civilization in which far more people actually live and work in the countryside, in which they try to ensure that people do not fall back into poverty. And then there are these actions on the global stage. And it's not simply the case, you know, you can't say that they're simply operating in the context of existing multilateral institutions. They do enter and operate in current multilateral institutions. But sometimes they've met resistance, you know, in the World Bank, IMF. So they're all, you know, you cannot say that the BRI or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank have actually decreased in importance. And it's interesting, if you listen to what Xi Jinping says about the aim, you know, of these international actions, he says, you know, three things, you know, one is peace, so the first deficit. The second one is development. The third one is governance, you know, governance which respects, you know, the rights of participation of all countries. So that lies behind where he's acting. And I just wanted to make a comment, you know, because you said, how does the Chinese system shape what's going on? Well, the first thing is, you know, you can't say that when China enters a trade agreement, it's purely driven by corporate interests, because Chinese corporate interests are in a sense subordinate to the Chinese government. You know, in China, the government rules, and its goal, you know, is, they say, you know, common prosperity. So a set of rules are created. I think, you know, I mean, I haven't looked, you know, some people, the fascinating presentations about the detail of the program. Those rules are rules that are relatively soft. They don't discriminate strongly against, you know, developing countries. But when questions are raised, Joseph raised questions about the involvement of civil society in the trade negotiations, and then talked about the way in which it was extended to e-commerce. Now, if you look at China's recent poverty alleviation program, a lot of the strategies were actually linked to e-commerce, where people in different parts of China, often remote parts of China, were finding ways of generating an increased income through the commercialization of, you know, locally produced organic products that they were selling through the internet. So if you want to address these issues of exclusion, poverty alleviation, in a sense, they've got to be addressed within each country. So you've got to shape, you know, change, you know, the actual actions, you know, that are implemented at a national level in order to achieve these kinds of objectives, because you don't solve these problems simply through creating a set of trade agreements. You know, it depends what's happening on the ground in each country. And I think that's a very important lesson.
Okay, thanks, Mick. Reina, did you have your hand up with a question for Chandru? Off you go then.
Yes, I was just wondering if Chandra could tell us a little bit more about China's position in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. As far as I know, it's got an observation status. Is this to be upgraded, or is it for, actually is the tendency to move away?
Yeah,
Chandru,
I
want to respond to Mick and Reina?
Yeah, so well, first Reina, you know, well, India is an observer in the SCO, and I think it wanted to be there, and more importantly because of its Eurasian strategy, but more importantly because China was wanting to say, still is wanting to set up a separate fund for the SCO, set up a separate development finance institution. Maybe India wanted to have a play there as well. But at the moment, you know, things are not very good. I mean, I think it would be a period of retreat, of a certain degree of distancing between China and India till such point of time as other issues get resolved. I agree with a lot of what Mick said, but there are two points I'd like to make. It's difficult given the developments in the South China Sea, given what's happened vis-a-vis even Bhutan, given, of course, what's happening vis-a-vis in Hong Kong and vis-a-vis Taiwan, and of course elsewhere in the South China Sea, to say that that China doesn't have a strategy of trying to assert itself, well, if not militarily, at least politically. That tendency is not there, and I think that's part of its strategy. And the second is, I do think this distinction between state and capital is problematic, particularly in Asia, because even as far as countries like Japan and South Korea, etc., which are successful, are concerned, is that there was a coalescence of state and private capital. In South Korea, it could happen because of the fact that after Japanese capital left, the South Korean state created its capitalists. China doesn't need to do this. China can actually create the coalescence of state and capital because of the fact that if private capital emerges and prospers in China, it has to do so with the actual express permission of the Chinese state. Now, it is true that China is trying to then get these corporates to move up the value chain, but it's in the nature of economic power that when you build new bases of monopoly power, you don't want to sacrifice old bases. And as far as your old bases are concerned, rising wages are a problem, and you would like to relocate those capacities. And I think Rcep might be used by China to protect its old bases of trading power while it builds new bases domestically based on advanced technology. That's the way I see it, but we should discuss this in greater detail later.
Quick follow-up. Chandru leaves 2 minutes. I guess, and Chandru, don't you think that given China's dual circulation strategy and the fact that it is now consciously expanding its own market, that rising wages are functional to the strategy of expanding your domestic market, are they not?
Of course, so you can have rebalancing domestically, but you can relook and you can move up the value chain in terms of the kind of industry you generate for export, but you can still go abroad and establish capacity based on public firm capital or private firms which are subordinate to the state and operate from those locations and use Rcep for that because it has harmonized tariffs and it has actually created rules of origin which cannot be used against China.
Right. So I know that Claudia has had her hand up for some time. And I'll ask you, Claudia, can you just wait for a couple of seconds more, unless you've actually got a question for Chandru, because if you have, then please put that before he goes.
Sure, no problem.
You have a specific question for Chandru?
Well, no, it's actually for the panel overall, so it's okay. I'd be happy with whoever addresses. Right. Thank you.
Very good, very good. So if you could just hang on just a little bit longer.
No problem. Thank you.
I just want to say a huge thank you to Chandru for his very, very thoughtful contributions there, and clearly has provoked some discussion. So before we lose the thread completely, I'd like to come on to Radhika's third question to the panelists speaking about Rcep, and her question was about should we not be a bit more critical about the flying goose formation. So I think that carries on the thread of the discussion. Which of the speakers on Rcep would like to take the question? Do people remember the question? Does Radhika want to repeat the question?
Chandru's already answered it partly, and I suppose the other person who's particularly, I guess, might want to say something about it is Joseph, but if he doesn't, that's fine too.
Joseph, is there anything you want to say also, perhaps in response to Mick's comments there?
Well, not directly in response to the particular question, but I was just wanted to say that my comments about the corporate agenda underpinning Rcep is really based on, well, on the one hand, if you look at the text that unfortunately only became available once the negotiations are concluded, right? So it's already giving, I mean, the people who are critical of these agreements are already at a great disadvantage in terms of understanding the implications of this agreement, because now you have to play catch up and look at the voluminous documents, not just the actual text, but the schedule of commitments of each country. That's why the study that I pointed out from Dr. Rashmi Banga of UNCTAD, working with other researchers from Boston University, actually looks at the actual schedule of commitments. You know, and I raised the point that, you know, we can argue who's driving the who drove the negotiations, and we can argue in support of ASEAN centrality. But in the end, if I think a critical question is who benefits from these agreements. And clearly from at least that study, which is a critical study, it shows that ASEAN will not benefit at all. So, and for ASEAN, the main question is really the flexibilities, because you have to look at the asymmetry that exists within ASEAN, where you have a country like Singapore, which is really a more developed country, but you also have countries like Myanmar, you have countries like Laos, and you have countries in the middle like the Philippines. So that's one point that I'd like to raise. Now, on the question of China, for me, and I'm not an academic, right? And I'm listening intently to all the points made here. But for me, a key question is, what kind of a power is China? Is it a revisionist power, or is it a status quo power? Is it there to change things up? If we are saying that it is trying to change things up for the better, then I don't see it in Rcep. I see Rcep more in relation to TPP and the corporate agenda that underpins most of these modern FTAs. So there are really more similarities to the China agenda here in Rcep and the US agenda in TPP, to my view. And so for me, the greater distinction is not between China and the US, because both of these countries are indeed pushing neoliberal corporate-driven policies. The greater distinction for me is between the people who are supposed to benefit from these agreements and the elite that are really benefiting. So I don't know, that's my comment. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Joseph. So Claudia's been waiting patiently there, so I'd like to move to Claudia's question, and if anyone else has a question as well, I'll take that following Claudia.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny. It was actually an elaboration what the speaker Joseph just said, because as much as I'm, thrilled, frankly, personally, right, to see a major challenge to U.S. hegemony at the geopolitical level, and as an internationalist and anti-imperialist, and I'm less familiar with China, although I have some familiarity, connections, and I've been there. I'm much more familiar with Latin America and the challenge that Latin America has presented to the so-called free trade frame of the NATO countries that led by the US are best exemplified by, for instance, the ALBA Treaty of Cooperation, where you really see cooperation among countries and filtering down in a real challenge to let me put it in a very simple way. That I think that what Joseph is saying is that you see internally the internal class system there being challenged. So you see I have seen them myself, real benefits for working people, for the working classes, and for indigenous communities and so on. So there you see it clearly. And I'd like to, as much as I'm, as I said, like so happy to see this treaty moving forward and challenging the so-called free trade frame, US led, I'd like to understand better how this new treaty will translate into real improvements for working classes and peasant communities in the countries involved, as Joseph just pointed out. Anyway, that was my question to the other folks, because we've heard already from Joseph his concerns, and if in fact in the treaty itself doesn't reflect that, what kind of reassurance can we have? Those of us who are both internationalists and also concerned with the class question within nations. How much will those classes within the nations be benefited from this new treaty? And maybe the other folks can elaborate on that as far as they are aware of or understand. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. And Radhika's got her hand up again.
Thanks. Thanks. Yes, quickly. I had actually another question, and that was for Horace. But anyone else who would like to respond to this, because it's really specifically relating to the United States, and perhaps also for Tomo. I mean, looking at these bigger established capitalist countries, particularly the United States and Japan, again, what is the split within? Is there a split among the capitalist classes in Japan? And I certainly think there is one in the United States in terms of whether to engage with China or to confront China. So if you could, and if so, if there is such a split, how is it defined? Which capitalists are on which side and why?
I'll just chip in with a couple of observation questions. Similarly, along the lines that the discussion is going, I'm wondering, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the building back better and the new normal after the pandemic, how much the pandemic has actually changed the situation for these regional agreements. And in particular in relation to Europe, how much pressure will there be on the jobs front? You talked about Angela Merkel and German industry, and I'm wondering how much pressure there will be from unions and from the workers for developing a deal with China, which could bring benefits to a lot of, in particular, new industries in Europe. I did actually see an interview with one of the critics of the CAI agreement. He was talking about the human rights question, but when he was asked about whether the human rights should actually override economic interests, he became quite tongue-tied. I'm wondering, how much pressure there will be in terms of the economy and in terms of jobs. And on the Rcep situation, we hear a lot about countries in East Asia. They don't want to make a choice. They want to have good relations with China for the economic relationship, China being their main trade partner. On the other hand, they want to have good relations with the United States for the military security aspect. But I'm wondering, really, I suppose, in terms of the pandemic as well, how much the new arrangements will come to bear on countries' perceptions of security, and whether the economic will outweigh the dependence on the United States for military security. And I suppose as a final observation, I think that the agreement on Rcep was certainly, and it had an influence in Europe and hastened the move towards the CAI. So I think that we should be looking at the dynamics, not only within the regional arrangements, but also in terms of movements forward in one regional organization can encourage movements forward in other regional organizations. I think that Reina has got his hand up, and if other people want to speak, please use the hands up function, because it means that you come to the top of my screen and I don't have to search through 3 or 4 viewing screens. So Reina, and then Mick wants to develop his contribution. Sorry, and there was a question specifically to Horace. So sorry, I just saw you there, Horace. I didn't see the hand function, but since you haven't spoken, please, will you respond to Radhika's question and anything else that you want to say? So you'll need to unmute.
Yes. In terms of Radhika's question on the different sectors of the capitalist class in the United States of America, they have found themselves in a major contradiction. The major contradiction stems from the fact that the big tech and finance, Wall Street, benefit from the military management of the international system. That is the ability to project force in order to force people to use the dollar. But that projection of force itself creates a contradiction internally and externally. And so there are sectors of the United States capital, such as finance, that wants to be in China and be opposed to China, big tech. But there are sectors, for example, one of the biggest employers in the United States, Walmart, does not want to have any contradiction with China, or a weaker section of the US capital, which is agriculture, which is a major part of the US economy, do not want to have contradictions with China. So the small capitalists, as we've seen in places like North Carolina, furniture makers who pushed the Vietnamese and pushed the sanctions against Vietnam, those are some of the things within the Republican Party who are pushing for the anti-China agenda. Now, in terms of the ruling elements in China, in the United States, one cannot get away from white supremacy as the guiding force behind attempting to maintain world economy. What they said is that for the first time, there was a non-white countries that challenged the United States of America. I wanted to make some comments on this matter, because if the United States is talking about competition with China, and the same ideas of competition with China inspires more racist attacks against Asian peoples in the United States of America, those Asian peoples inside the United States of America who were hesitant about their solidarity with the Black forces, or the leading forces of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism in the United States of America, the rhetoric against China is having an impact inside the United States of America in strengthening the alliance between the anti-racist forces in the United States of America. That's a point that we should not miss. The second point I want to make is with respect to Joseph, that he is entirely correct that in terms of Rcep, this does not benefit the working peoples, the working poor, the oppressed in the ASEAN countries or in the other countries. But the point about these free trade agreements is that free trade agreements are usually promoted based on strength. And you cannot have 3 or 4 strong powers in the world. The point about Rcep is, even with its limitations, it's a direct challenge to the dominance of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, and to the kind of exceptionalism that the United States and the Europeans carved out for themselves within the WTO structure. In fact, what the situation with COVID pointed out is how the WTO structure has broken down. Both the United States and the Europeans carved out for themselves ability to provide subsidies, especially in agriculture, for their farmers at the expense of farmers in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And what the struggles around intellectual property is doing is to force to the forefront those contradictions within the WTO and within the alliance between Europeans and the North Americans. The last point I want to make is with respect to the implications of Rcep for the rest of the world, especially the dollar. The fact is that the European Union, by its existence, represents a bigger threat to the United States of America than the Chinese, because in the area of the Middle East, in terms of indexing the sales of oil in dollars or the euro, in the immediate sense of any crisis in the global situation, the problem that the Americans will have is not with the Chinese, because the RMB is not in its present form. It will not be able to be an international currency. So the contradictions among the capitalists internationally are maturing to the point that they cannot be resolved through rhetoric that is coming from the political leadership of the United States at the present moment.
Thanks very much. Now, Tomu, did I see your hand up? I just want to give an opportunity to the speakers who haven't spoken before.
Okay, yeah.
Well,
yeah. So with regards to the impact of Rcep and for the working class, I think there's no foreseeable benefit for the working class. So I think it's a kind of capitalist elitist agreement. And responding to Radical's question, I think potentially Japanese capitalists are quite embarrassed with the current, strong alliance between U.S. and Japan, which is provocation towards China. But I don't think they are openly criticizing the government for these provocations. But so I think they tacitly, be engaged in Chinese business as usual, while being quiet about the security issues, which just came to the forefront. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Tomu. So Reina, and then Mick, and then I'll see whether any of the other speakers want to come in with any concluding remarks. Reina?
Yeah, okay, thanks. The comprehensive agreement on investment with EU and China, I mean, it's not the agreement that China been pushing for. It was something the Europeans wanted very dearly in order to control Chinese investments better in Europe and prevent the outflow of critical technologies, etc. And basically what's happening here with the European Parliament cancelling or actually creating a situation in which the agreement may be shelved for quite a while, they shoot themselves in their own knee. And so it is not in the I mean, that's a point to keep in mind. That the other point I meant to, that was your question on the different capital factions in the United States. I would like to, basically Horace already said most of what I wanted to say, but I'd like to remind that much of the US-China trade is actually or the Chinese exports in the United States is actually intra-firm trade. And from that point of view, you have quite, you will not find that actually in the trade statistics, because intra-firm trade is registered as that you have to have at least 51% of the company in China. Now that's very difficult, but in most cases, the US corporations have some kind of structure in which they still call the shots or through their orders, but it is basically intra-firm trade. And if you would exclude this from the trades from the US-China trade, there wouldn't be any deficit. In fact, it would be quite the opposite. And therefore, there is, whilst at the same time, I mean, this faction is, again, what Horace said, very, very interested in keeping good relations with China because they profit from it. On the other hand, you have, and it was actually this particular aspect of trade which Trump was targeting with his policy. Only this then, this purely economic targeting of Trump then subsequently was picked up by the, what I call the security, foreign policy security establishment, by the guys of the Pentagon, CIA, etc., who've been for already long before the actual pivot to Asia was passed, where already you look at the old Pentagon reports back to 2010 and earlier, already there China was identified as the potential future superpower and the potential enemy later on, actually enemy of the United States. So they piggybacked on this kind of move, and as a result, it was carried on now in the Biden administration, and we won't see much of a change from what was happened before, because these people were already sitting in the driving seats of U.S.-China foreign policy before Trump even came to power. And on the financial issues, I would like to underline that China and Russia do have a number of projects going and are quite advanced, for instance, to replace the SWIFT international payment system. And just recently, it was against Lavrov and his Chinese homologue, I think only last week or the past week, where they called again, not only called, where they actually talked about this progress being made, and they are now running tests, etc. And they are actually moving away, creating an alternative international payment system. They've been buying and adding gold for the last few years. And from the moment they begin to actually back the ruble or back the yuan against gold, they could actually at least create their own currency reserve system along what we would call the Silk Road areas, or in South. So that out of this, I see will develop a real serious challenge to the US, to the global reserve currency of the dollar. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Reina. And I've just noticed here, I just want to slip in this question from Renate, who has pointed out some contradictions in US finance capital, saying, hasn't US finance capital been rushing into China? So if people can, I don't know if Horace is still there, people can bear that in mind, but I'll go to Mick and then I'll see whether anyone's got any other concluding remarks.
Okay, Jenny referred to an interview and mentioned human rights. I mean, the US plan clearly is to try to lure Europe and the Quad on human rights and security issues. And then after that, it obviously wants to extend the conflict to economic cooperation with China. I don't want to engage with the truthfulness or otherwise of many of these claims that are made. I mean, most of them are fabrications in my view, but what I do want to ask is by what right Western liberalism, North American, European liberalism, by what right does it decide what counts as human rights in our world? I think, this is a very, very serious question that I think, needs to be addressed. To my mind, the most fundamental human right is the right to life. And you don't live, without food, shelter, clothing, medical assistance, and an absence of war. So I seriously think, that a lot of this criticism is coming from progressive people, and I'm deeply, deeply shocked. Deeply shocked. That's the first comment. The second one I want to make is that today, or yesterday, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, signed a 25-year agreement with Iran. So it's a very significant agreement. It was described, someone actually pointed out that what had in fact happened was that China, Russia, and Iran had established an alliance of sovereignty. The right of sovereign states to choose their own paths and to shape their own futures. So I come back to something that I said earlier. I mean, absolutely, the position of the working class, of the poor, of people who don't have work, the people who don't have adequate housing, the people who don't have adequate food are vital, vital issues. But, to a large extent, they're things that are going to have to be dealt with by each social formation, each society. You can't expect someone else to come and solve them for you. I mean, China's concern is, in that sense, is to solve the problems of its own people. And it's been remarkably successful in doing so. Other countries have to then find instruments to deal with these same issues in the way that fits, their conditions, that fits their values, that fits, their view about the way in which they want to go forward. So I think this idea of the reassertion of sovereignty against the imposition of external rules determined, by a tiny minority of the world's population is one of the sort of central issues.
Thanks very much, Mick. I don't know whether anyone wants to respond to the question about the different trends in US finance capital.
Horace did, yeah. Horace, and then me, please.
Horace, please.
Good, thank you. I want to emphasize the fact that US finance capital is now caught in a trap of its own making, because the initiatives taken by Singapore, which is becoming a very important center for digital commerce and digital trade relationship. Singapore is now the second largest financial center after New York. It is fast overtaking the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom shot itself in the leg through Brexit. And so the Singapore becomes the base for Chinese capital, as well as Taiwan's Hong Kong capital, as well as South Korean and Japanese capital. Now, the fact is that the United States, big tech, opposed the investment in new technologies such as 5G and 6G, and oppose investment in moving in those directions, and now want to play catch up using military threats against China and Huawei and such companies. So it's a contradiction that it finds itself in that it cannot escape from, because it has benefited from the ability to print dollars in the past, and the new agreements, as was being pointed out, between Russia and China, and recently between China and Iran, means that its weaponization of the dollar is being circumscribed. And I think finance capital is caught in a trap in the United States of America. And the question is whether those who are pushing the military line to resolve the contradictions will win. I want to end by talking about the human rights and these contradictions for the United States of America. Racism in the United States of America meant that while the United States of America has been talking about human rights internationally, the United States is the main violator of international human rights standards. The United States of America said it was going into Afghanistan to fight for the rights of women, but the United States of America has refused to sign the International Convention on Discrimination Against Women. The United States has refused to sign the Convention on the Rights of Children, the conventions on torture, the two conventions on immigrants. So the question that the United States has been able to do with the help of intellectuals is to push an agenda which represents itself as being leading a rules-based international system when that rules-based system was simply based on white supremacy. And what the International Commission on the Police Violence Against Killing of Black People in the United States has done is that they've done an international commission of inquiry, and they're going to take the United States of America before the International Criminal Court. So the question of racism in the United States of America is having an impact on the foreign policy of the United States of America to the point where the Chinese have turned around and says, well, what about George Floyd? That's just the beginning of what we're going to see in the international political system.
Thank you very much. Now, Radhika, I know you've got your hand up, but Alan's put his hand up, and I'm just thinking that perhaps I should ask you, Radhika, to come in right at the very end. Will that be okay with you? And we're now approaching the end because we've been, this is, 2.5 hours. So I will take Alan, and then I'll see whether anyone else from the panel speakers who hasn't spoken recently wants to make any more remarks. And then I'll bring Radhika in to finish off, if that's okay.
You've also got Reina and Mick, I'm sorry to tell you.
I thought they were leftover hands.
No. I just wanted to answer on your.
Well, I want Alan to speak because he's not spoken before, and if we'll come back to Reina and Mick very briefly because you've had several of those. So I don't know whether Bruno or Joseph wants to say anything. So Alan.
We can't hear you, Alan.
Alan, are you unmuted?
It's not unmuted, it's the microphone was down. Can you hear me now?
Oh, right.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, it's got a switch on it, which I forget. I just want to follow from what Horace said with what might seem slightly moving sideways, but it's to talk about Latin America. Because two reasons. One, Latin America is, along with North America, a continent that faces two ways, to the Pacific and to the Atlantic. So therefore, as a Pacific continent, its relation to China is very fundamental to the next stage of the evolution of what is now happening. And Claudia mentioned Latin America, but we haven't talked much about it. It is also the soft underbelly of American imperialism, and it is where American and Canadian imperialism and racism is most clearly exposed. 4 days ago, Argentina left the Lima Group. And this was known that it was going to leave it, but it did it formally. And the president of Argentina has been in the center rather than, I would say perhaps the left. It was a necessary compromise, in my view, that Kirchner made in order to defeat Macri. But the fact that they've now made this move is highly significant. And they specifically mentioned not only the need for dialogue with Venezuela, but for economic relations with Venezuela, which means the issue of economic regionalism in Latin America is on the agenda again. Now, this is very important because though the continent faces onto both oceans, it's actually a composite of countries which are Atlantic countries and Pacific countries. It's not like the United States of America or Canada, which has two coasts, or like Russia, which has two coasts. Therefore, regional unity in Latin America is actually fundamental both to the processes that John spoke about and to relations with China. And I think that China's evaluation of Latin America is going to be very important. Now, what's the connection to human rights? Is the appalling treatment of indigenous people across the whole continent of America. And this is particularly so in Canada. I could go into it, there's not time, but at some point, I think we actually need some sort of session on the rights of indigenous people of the International Manifesto groups, which is very lively in both North America and Latin America, where the majority of people are of indigenous origin and are held down by these horrific dictatorships. Bolsonaro is just an example amongst many. So the fact that Canada is leading the charge alongside the worst violators of human rights on the continent of America, on behalf of America, on behalf of the US of A, is a standing condemnation of their, liberal, hypocritic denunciations of Xinjiang and so on. So I think there are two issues, one from the human rights point of view, the violation of indigenous human rights in the continent of America and the responsibility of the mining industries and the military of the North American countries needs to be raised. And second, I think that the raising of human rights as an issue allows us to address some of the contradictions within the capitalist class of the North Americans, which is very important. I'll just say one thing further, sorry about this, but I attended a very moving meeting organized by the Simon Bolivar University 3 days ago, in which they announced the calling of a Congress of the Peoples, a World Congress of the Peoples in June. And this was a very moving meeting. There was 971 participants live. And they're proposing to have a literal Congress of the peoples. The people who spoke there were not the classical political parties, they were representatives of popular movements across the world. If this is now expanded, and online technology paradoxically makes that possible, into a people's gathering in June, which is as representative of the resistance to racism as that meeting was that I attended 3 days ago, I think this would be a mammoth milestone. So, more indeed than the sort of World Social Forum and the impact that had at the time. So I think that the two issues of coupling what China's effect is on the way that world relations are being reshaped with what is happening in Latin America is and the racism of North America towards the indigenous peoples of the continent they colonized is actually a very important thing to do.
Thanks very much, Alan. So Tomu, Bruno, Horace, Joseph, if he's still there, anyone want to? Joseph has got his hand up. If anyone else wants to make some concluding remarks, now is the time to put your hand up. If not, I will go to Joseph, then Reina briefly, then Radhika, and then we'll wind up. Joseph.
Yes, just want to thank everyone and Radhika and the group for inviting me, and want to underscore the point that I think many have conceded here, that Rcep will not benefit working class people, and that the elite corporate interests are the ones that is being advanced in this agreement. I also submit that Rcep is not a deviation or is not challenging the dominant economic model that many progressives have pointed out is a broken economic model that has worsened global inequality, destroyed the environment, exacerbated climate change, and undermined human rights. We see Rcep as further propping up this broken economic model, and we need to radically transform this model, especially in light of the pandemic, in favor of one or more models that are more just, that prioritize the needs of the poor and marginalized over corporate profit. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. So Reina, then Horace, then Radhika. Reina, very briefly.
Just to answer your question concerning the money flow from Wall Street into China right now, That is a result of the China's change in monetary policy. Unlike Europe and the United States, they have taken the foot from the monetary accelerator. The bourses actually dropped, the stock exchange dropped by 15% over the last month. But at the same time, the currency, the Chinese currency, has increased against the dollar. And as we can see over this year and up to next year, the Europeans and the Germans will keep printing money like nobody has seen. But the Chinese won't. There is a fair chance that this trend undoubtedly will continue. And I think that is a fair explanation for the money flow into China. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Horace, last words?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to underline the point about racism against the indigenous peoples, because one cannot speak from any point of view in the Americas without speaking about the genocide against the indigenous people and the continued exploitation of the indigenous peoples in the Americas. So I wanted to underline that point and to see that the International Commission of Inquiry into Police Violence Against Black People has underlined the importance of reparative justice. And on the reparative justice, we're putting in the question of reparative claims. And reparative claims is not about money, it's about rewriting the understanding of the international political economy in relationship to racism, imperialism, and the current conjuncture. In that sense, the putting on the table the question of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Reparations is part of the task of intellectuals to break out of the discourses that come from Western European liberalism, of which North American liberalism is an extension of Western European liberalism, and liberalism is basically racism. So the point that I want to make is that reparative justice has to do with repairing the planet Earth, repairing relations between human beings, and repairing how we could build a sustainable relations between human beings that is not based on imperialism and racism.
Thank you very much, Horace. And last words to Radhika before I wind up.
Okay, I just wanted to quickly respond to the question about the Wall Street's interest in the Chinese financial system. And I would say, obviously, number one, the Wall Street system is expansionist and it is trying to look for places to nest everywhere. And so China is not excluded. But the key thing to remember is that the Chinese financial system is not like the Wall Street-based, dollar-based financial system. It's completely the opposite. People have already pointed to the fact that there are there are alternatives, that the Wall Street system is being weaponized, etc. But the key thing to understand about the Wall Street system is it is now kind of suffering under the weight. It is not exactly yet collapsing, but it could soon collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, because historically it has been based on short-term, unproductive, speculative, predatory finance, whereas the financial systems of the genuinely, shall we say, the contender countries, that includes China, but once also included Germany, for example, were based on providing long-term patient capital for productive purposes. China still has such a system. And I think, as far as I know, although there are many hotheads in China who would like to internationalize the system in the way that the American system is internationalized, which would mean going in that direction, there are enough people, I think, who recognize that the system has been absolutely functional to China's massive rise, particularly to keeping those astronomical rates of investment up that account for Chinese growth. And I don't think they're going to give it up easily. A final point, the fact that the American system is collapsing, is going to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, there is no better sign of the fact than that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has been expanding. It has been expanding precisely because it needs to support the very markets which basically are losing customers, where basically people no longer want to buy those assets. So the Fed is supporting the existing values of those assets, but the question is, it's a completely self-defeating operation. It's only a question of when it will collapse. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Radhika. So for my part, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our panelists for an extremely stimulating, thought-provoking, and as I say, very informative discussion. There was a huge amount of ground that we've covered, and also ground that we might have covered even more. I think that I'm sure that those of us who have been attending quite a few of the discussions can see the key themes and the focuses that we're developing here. I think that perhaps we also need to think more about a left response, and bearing in mind the points that have been made about the interests of workers and peasants, and also American workers and workers in Europe, as the developed countries as well. So we have to be coming up with ways of addressing those interests. So I think it remains for me to remind you that the next discussion, which will take place in a fortnight on April the 11th, is on the longer telegram, so focusing on the United States and the Cold War with China. And then we have another discussion on April the 27th. Is that right, Radhika? Shaking her head?
Yes.
April the 27th?
Yes, yet to be finalized. People will hear about it.
Right, fine, okay. Now, I also wanted to say, you know, I'm sure that we recognize how important an initiative this group is, and how huge the intellectual challenges are to understanding what is a rapidly evolving and uncertain world situation. The membership of the group, thanks very much to Radhika's driving force, the membership is growing. We can all contribute to extending the membership. And also for thinking up ideas for further panels, but not just, I mean, you know, the ideas for further panels in this changing situation, there's a great number of suggestions that we can make, but we also need to be thinking about panel members. So when we're thinking about putting forward ideas, we can also think about making some suggestions for panel members. So I think that once again, a great thank you for our speakers, and also for our attendees, because we've been going on for nearly 3 hours. So great stuff, guys, and see you again in a fortnight.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Jenny, were you waiting to just debrief afterwards?